So when you vote this year, you might be in a different congressional district than before. Let's begin tonight with a controversy over redistricting in Alabama. Last year, Alabama's Republican-controlled legislature drew the state's new congressional map. That resulted in 6 majority white districts, the ones in yellow, and 1 majority black district, the one in red. That's in the Birmingham area. Now, Alabama overall is about 27% black. So by that math, 27% of the population generally gets 100 divided by 7, about 14% of the congressional vote. That's why critics of this map say it dilutes the electoral power of black voters. And 2 weeks ago, a federal court agreed. A panel of 3 judges, 2 of whom were appointed by former President Trump, ruled that the map violated the Voting Rights Act. The panel's opinion was more than 200 pages long, and among other things, the judges wrote, quote, "Black voters have less opportunity than other Alabamians to elect candidates of their choice to Congress," unquote. Now, the court ordered the Alabama legislature to revise the map so that 2 congressional districts would have a substantial portion of black voters. Instead, the state appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and last night, justices sided with the state. They voted 5-4 to stay the lower court's ruling for now, although it might face a full hearing later. Justice Brett Kavanaugh wrote to explain his vote on the stay. He made it clear that this ruling is not a, quote, position on the ultimate merits of the party's underlying legal dispute, unquote, meaning the maps might violate the Voting Rights Act, or they might not. Justice Kavanaugh's point is that it would be too disruptive to the Alabama primary on May 24th to change things now. Last night on MSNBC, the incoming president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund questioned that reasoning.
The Supreme Court, based on a principle, not even actual law and precedent, but on a principle that was articulated in a case out of 2006 called Purcell, the court, in a concurring opinion, decided that allowing the maps to be redrawn within 7 weeks of the earliest date of the kickoff of the election would somehow be disruptive and violate a principle that, as I said, is not in fact law, but is a notion that has come to govern election law cases in the past several years.
Now, Chief Justice John Roberts joined the court's more liberal justices. He voted against the stay, writing that the lower court got its ruling right. Justice Elena Kagan wrote a lengthy dissent. She noted that leaving these maps in place, quote, does a disservice to black Alabamians who have had their electoral power diminished in violation of a law this court once knew to buttress all of American democracy, unquote. Joining us now is Alabama's Secretary of State, John Merrill. He oversees Alabama's elections and was the litigant in these court cases representing the state. Secretary Merrill, welcome. Glad to have you with us.
My pleasure to be with you, yes.
Before I get into some of the concerns over the maps, let me just start with your general stance on them. Scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you that these maps treat all Alabamians, especially black Alabamians, fairly? Scale of 1 to 10.
Well, it's difficult to answer that question that way because what you want in any maps that are drawn anytime is to ensure that the population of the area is properly represented. And in our state, 26.7% of our population is African American. 69.1% of our population is white Alabamians. And I think it's important to know that it's difficult to make sure you had 2 proper congressional districts drawn in order to make sure that those African Americans are represented with 2 majority-minority districts simply because you don't have that many African Americans living in the same geographic area.
I think the fact that you didn't just say 10 speaks to the issue within this lawsuit. Though I hear you in terms of the difficulties of drawing these maps. No one has nailed this down, I think, to a science that satisfies everyone. But the question of that is really kind of at the under.
Sure, if you ever get a state that says they've got a 10 every time, you need to bottle them up and ship them to the other 49. I can assure you of that.
Well, that's kind of the issue within this lawsuit. I mean, one of the things that was brought up in the lower court ruling, and I'm quoting from the lower court ruling, Alabama's extensive history of repugnant racial and voting-related discrimination is undeniable and well documented. Defendants, the state, defendants argue that Alabama has come a long way, but the question for us is more pointed. Has it come far enough for these factors to be neutral or to weigh in favor of defendants? Secretary Merrill, I wonder how you contemplate the answer to that, particularly Alabama's past and what it means now for drawing these maps.
Well, the point is very well taken. And one of the things that I've shared multiple times when I've testified before Congress about our efforts to just register voters. I mean, since January the 19th, 2015, as of today, we've registered 1,984,029 new voters in our state. We now have 3,621,553 registered voters in Alabama. 96% of all eligible African Americans in Alabama are registered to vote. 91% of all eligible white Alabamians are registered to vote, and 94% of all eligible Alabamians are registered to vote. No state in the union has made the progress that we've made in that same period of time. Are there still other areas that need improvement, other areas that need to be worked on? Without a doubt. Are we doing everything we can each and every day in the office of the Secretary of State? Without question. And we're going to continue to do that as long as I have the privilege to serve in this role. We're going to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat.
That is remarkable, Secretary Merrill, but that doesn't quite answer my question. You were talking about whether African Americans are registered to vote. This quote from the district court ruling has to do with whether they'll be able to vote in districts that fairly reflect the populations in their areas in light of Alabama's history of disenfranchising black voters.
Well, Josh, as you know, we have one majority-minority district in the state of Alabama today. We have had that same district since 1992 when reapportionment created that district. Josh, I have been living in that district since 1992. I am a resident of the majority-minority district currently represented by Terry Sewell in the United States Congress. My daughter actually interned for Congresswoman Sewell because she represents us. So District 7 represents the people who live there, not just African Americans, but the people who live in that district, and I'm one of those residents.
With regard to other districts, though, Secretary, that might have been created, the Supreme Court case, and we should be clear, the ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court did not rule on the merits of whether or not the maps would survive. It was more about the timing and whether or not there was time to kind of alter these maps now. There is a precedent, the Gingles case, that sets out a three-pronged test to determine whether or not there is a case that plaintiffs could bring like this. And we'll put them up so people can see them. I won't get too deep into the legalese, but basically the conditions are that a minority group is sufficiently large and geographically compact to constitute a minority in a district, that minority is politically cohesive, and that the white majority votes sufficiently as a bloc to enable it usually to defeat the minority's preferred candidate. So those are the three conditions for a case like this. Mr. Secretary, do you believe that if these maps actually went to court, if there was actually oral argument, a hearing before the Supreme Court, how well do you think these maps would survive this three-pronged test?
Josh, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult in the state of Alabama to have two majority-minority districts that are represented by a majority population of African Americans because of the numbers that I just gave you. And you said the first element in that three-pronged test was to have them in a compact geographic area. You're not going to have that in the state of Alabama because of where African Americans live. It's where they choose to live. And we think that that's important, that the representation for those people be respective of the individuals that live there, obviously. But you also want to make sure that you're not continuing to promote a gerrymandered district that would not represent all the people that live in a particular area.
So can we just be clear, do you believe that Alabama's maps survived this test or not?
Well, this is what I know. I know that it's beyond me. When I was a member of the Alabama legislature, I helped to draw the maps that were approved between 2010 and 2020. Now, as the Secretary of State, my job is just to implement the maps that are presented to us by the Alabama legislature. Obviously, these maps were challenged in court. They were actually challenged, Josh, and you may know this very well, before they were ever produced. There was already a lawsuit filed. And what we know is that the Supreme Court has said that these maps are acceptable for the 2022 election cycle. What happens in 2024?
That is not, I'm sorry, sir, that is not what the Supreme Court said. The court did not rule on the quality of the maps. Justice Kavanaugh, in his opinion, only said that the timing of this case, based on when the primary comes in late May, is too close for the court to rule out of concern for upsetting the process. He said very plainly in his ruling that he was making no opinion. He was casting no opinion on whether the maps were fair or not. So I'm sorry, but that's not true.
Josh, before you interrupted me, what I was saying was the maps are going to be used in the 2022 cycle, but it made no mention about whether or not they would be acceptable 2024, 2026, or 2028, leading up again to the reapportionment cycle in 2030 and beyond. So we do know that they have been approved to be used for 2022 in our May 24th primary, June 21st runoff, and the November 8th general election.
Let me ask you about what happens going forward. You know, the court has left open the possibility that these might actually go forward for larger hearing. That may yet happen in the fall. Critics of the map say that's too late for the primary, but at least they left open the possibility that there would be some kind of hearing in court. Justice Kagan, in her lengthy dissent, wrote that the plaintiffs brought 17 witnesses over 7 days, and they brought 11 possible other plans for the way that these maps could be drawn, and also wrote that the defense's expert witness was disregarded by the lower court for weak expertise, for not reviewing all the plaintiff's evidence, for offering what the lower court believed were unsupported opinions in his testimony. I have to ask you this, in this politically charged environment, with all these questions around the Supreme Court, if the Supreme Court did not have a conservative majority with 3 justices appointed by President Trump, do you think this might have gone a different way?
Well, that would call on speculation or conjecture on my part to determine what individuals who are not currently on the court might think about something that they have never seen nor has been introduced to them. I can say that I know what this court did. I read the opinion that was issued by the sitting justices, and we know that it was considered, and now we know what we have to do from this point forward, beginning on May 24th when we have our primary vote, and then again with the runoff on June 21st, and then the general election November the 8th.
Last thing I would ask, for Black Alabamians who look at this map and are concerned about what may happen to their capacity to vote for lawmakers that really reflect their needs and the needs of their areas, what would you recommend as just the state's top election official to make sure that they're registered and ready to vote this May?
Well, we certainly want anyone that's not currently registered to vote, if they are a United States citizen and they reside in Alabama, we want them to be registered to vote and to have a photo ID so they can participate at the level that they choose to. They can do so through our mobile app at alabamavotes.gov, on our website, Vote for Alabama on the mobile app, and they can call our office 334-242-7200, and we would love to have them make sure that they are registered and ready to participate. I think it should also be noted that our legislative district in the Alabama House and the Alabama Senate now have more majority-minority representation than in any other time in the history of the state of Alabama. So even though we still have work to do, we're doing great work in Alabama. We're proud of that, and we're going to continue to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat in Alabama.
And that site, again, is Alabama Votes, all one word, alabamavotes.gov. John Merrill, the Secretary of State in the state of Alabama. Secretary Merrill, I really appreciate you making time to talk this through with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josh. My pleasure.
Let's continue now with Jeffrey Rosen. He's a professor at the George Washington University Law School, and he's also the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center. Professor Rosen, welcome back.
Good to be here.
I wonder what your thoughts were on our conversation with Secretary Merrill, particularly in light of the concerns that the lower court raised and the Supreme Court did not address about Alabama's new maps.
Well, you were absolutely right to press him on what the court actually held. And you're also correct that the court did not in any way bless Alabama's map. The central matter of dispute was timing. As Janae Nelson said earlier, the court applied this doctrine called the Purcell principle, which says courts shouldn't change the rules of an election too close to an election. Remember, that's exactly the same principle that was at issue in the election of 2020 when the liberal and conservative justices were disagreeing about whether lower courts could review the constitutionality of election fraud cases. But here, the conservatives said it was too close to the election. The liberals disagreed with that. But the central substantive dispute was whether Alabama was right to impose a whole new requirement that the Supreme Court has never recognized before, and to try to draw a new majority-minority district with race wholly out of mind, whether new computer technology might make it possible to draw a new district not even thinking about race. And as Justice Kagan said in her dissent, that's a new principle. You'd have to change the law and narrow the Voting Rights Act to embrace that principle. It's wrong to make the lower court apply it because it's not the law of the land right now. Plus, there's no evidence that even things would come out differently if you applied this new principle. So the liberals and conservatives are strongly disagreeing, first about whether the Supreme Court's right to intervene, and second about whether to change the existing law. And neither of those principles in any way blesses or approves of what Alabama's doing.
Can you dig in a little bit more on the timing issue? I mean, I think that the argument from the state of Alabama is we're fine going to court on this if the Supreme Court wants to hear the case. We're very close to the election right now. We're confident in the maps that we have. We can litigate this later. If there's a problem, we can come back to it in the fall.
Exactly. That's exactly what Alabama said, and that's the argument that the conservatives embrace. Justice Kagan said, Alabama did everything right here. They sued the moment they could. Any delays were the state's fault. And in the past, the Supreme Court has not applied this Purcell principle many, many months before the election would actually take place. The election is not until November, the primary is in the spring. And Purcell had been used to say, don't change the rules, in the days or weeks before an election. Here, there's lots of time. The Supreme Court's not going to actually rule on this, possibly as late as next June. And the liberal justices were saying, hey, you're applying this principle basically to prevent judges from reviewing constitutional challenges to voting rights arrangements much more strenuously than you've done in the past.
I wonder what your sense is of whether this would pass that three-prong test from the case Thornburg versus Gingles. We mentioned it earlier. We'll put the three prongs of that test up back on the screen. Secretary of State Merrill said that it might not succeed on the first part, and I'm paraphrasing him, because this idea of having a minority group in a sufficiently large and compact area, that doesn't really apply to Alabama's geography, presumably because a lot of the state is very rural. What would you make of that argument, Professor?
The district court rejected that argument explicitly. It found that you could, in fact, draw two majority-minority districts in an extremely compact and cohesive way. The challenge is a different one than the one the Secretary raised. As Justice Kagan said, the claim is now that new voting technology makes it possible to draw districts without even thinking about race, without having race in mind at all, and that the court should have required that race-blind approach. Now, as Justice Kagan said, the Supreme Court has never required you to be race-blind in the past. The whole point of the voting rights amendments of Section 2 is to maximize the ability of minority voters to elect representatives of their choice. And Justice Kagan suggested that it would represent a radical narrowing of the law, even more than the court already did in the Brnovich decision last June, to impose this new requirement, which no one has ever heard of before and has never been litigated. So that's going to be the central question when the court actually hears the case next year. And it may be, in fact, it looks like the tea leaf suggests that there could well be a conservative majority willing to embrace this new requirement, saying you can't even think about race when you're trying to draw new majority-minority districts. That would make it much tougher to create these districts, and as Justice Kagan said, would represent a big change in the law.
One more thing before I have to let you go. One more quote from Justice Kagan's lengthy dissent. Among other things, she wrote, quote, "Today's decision is one more in a disconcertingly long line of cases in which this court uses its shadow docket to signal or make changes in the law without anything approaching full briefing and argument," unquote. Professor, before I got to let you go, not to get too deep in the weeds, but what does she mean by that, using its shadow docket?
It's very important. The shadow docket is an expedited procedure where the court will make decisions without hearing full briefs and arguments, and basically will step in and change the law without telling you what it's doing. That challenge was persuasive to Chief Justice Roberts, and he joined the liberals in this case. It was a 5-4 decision because he said you should basically let the district court do its thing without intervening on this shadow docket, without the benefit of full briefing and arguments. And this has been a big criticism. The President Biden Supreme Court Commission expressed concern about the shadow docket. And the critics are saying that it's not fair to make such important constitutional decisions without full briefing and argument.
Well, we will see what the court does when it takes this case up later on in the year. GW Law Professor Jeffrey Rosen, always a pleasure to see you. And I should note, by the way, tomorrow we will be joined by a member of the Alabama NAACP to talk about this case. Professor, thanks very much. Still to come, college hazing is the target of a bill in Congress. Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown joins us to discuss a bill designed to keep students safe and alive. We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. Parents have lots of concerns when they send their children off to college. Safety is high on that list. Sometimes the biggest concerns over safety stem from fraternities and sororities. Hazing has kept these organizations under scrutiny for a long time. At some schools, these groups are the gateways to and gatekeepers of social life on campus. The parents of 19-year-old Danny Santulli just sued the Phi Gamma Delta chapter at the University of Missouri. Their son has been in a coma since last October. He got alcohol poisoning during a Pledge Father reveal party. The National Fraternity and the University of Missouri both suspended the local chapter right after that incident. And this is not an isolated incident. Back in 2017, a student at Florida State died after a similar incident. That led to jail time for frat members, a settlement with the group, and an anti-hazing law that passed in Florida. Various states have proposed and passed anti-hazing legislation. Virginia's Senate recently approved Adams Law. It would require colleges to provide a hazing prevention curriculum and calls for advisors to train students. The bill would also make public and private colleges publish their student organizations' violations of the Code of Conduct online. But are these state laws enough, or does more need to be done on the federal level? Joining us now is Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio. He's co-sponsoring two anti-hazing bills, the End All Hazing Act and the REACH Act. Senator Brown, welcome. Good to see you again.
Good to be back. Thanks.
What makes these bills personally important to you?
Well, I've seen what happens to families in Ohio where someone dies from the parent sends a child off to college, and 3 months later that child dies, and in some kind of hazing incident that a family never gets over. So we want to make sure that we shine a light on what happened and that we can prevent this in the future. I mean, no parent should. I mean, parents are always going to worry. I've had kids go off to school. I still worry about them in their 30s and 40s, but parents shouldn't have to worry about that happening just because a son's joining a fraternity or a daughter's joining a sorority. That's not the issue. The issue is this kind of activity and action that schools have to own up to.
Let's talk about these two bills a bit more. The End All Hazing Act, that's Senate Bill 775, which was introduced by Republican Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, and then Senate Bill 744, the REACH Act, introduced by Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota. Talk about what these two bills are designed to do.
Yeah, they're both bipartisan, and this is an issue that really doesn't know partisan boundaries, particularly as you'd think. It essentially says schools, first of all, we need to define what hazing actually is. There are differences of opinion. We need Health and Human Services in Washington to define what it is, working with colleges and universities and activist groups and advocacy groups define what it is, and then we've got to make sure that schools are reporting it on their crime report every year. Schools are required under federal law to report crimes on campus. This should be included in that. So when a parent thinks, okay, where am I going to send my daughter to school? Well, this school has a reputation of some hazing incidents that have resulted in deaths of students. I'm not sure I want to send my child there. So I think this is self-enforcing because schools have to take responsibility for this, and they know if their crime report shows hazing incidents, that it will dissuade some parents. So make your school as safe as possible. These bills working together will help do that.
I just want to dig in on part of what you said in terms of what the bills would do. Part of what you said is that they would define what hazing is. I imagine that's part of the challenge in terms of enforcing it, which is figuring out the line between an initiation process that may be a little messy, a little embarrassing, but not necessarily rising to the level of criminality, and then the point at which it crosses a line.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I mean, I don't have the qualifications to make that determination. And typically, we don't write that kind of language into a law because it's just too hard to do and the world changes. But the federal government passes down rules all the time on all kinds of things. They should define it again, not just unilaterally, but working with universities, working with advocacy groups, working with parents who have lost children. Because a number of them, like Stone Foltz in Ohio, where we named one of the bills after, his death has been a call to action for a lot of people. So once that definition's in place, then schools know what to stop from happening, and then those schools, if they fail, it's part of their crime report, and it affects the reputation of the school. So that as all crimes on campus do. So you don't want to send your child to a campus that's had too many crimes committed, whether it's hazing or something else. And this will help clarify that and help the sort of self-enforcement mechanism that schools will do and parents will be part of.
How do you work with colleges and universities and Greek letter organizations on something like this? I mean, I totally understand the need to keep people safe on campuses. I also understand how fraternities and sororities are a big part of campus life. I went to the University of Miami, where Greek life is very significant, partly because it was such a large commuter school. And when people muted to campus, Greek organizations were kind of a backbone of student life on campus. So I can understand people who'd be concerned about changing the culture so much that it kind of denatures the culture of what it means to be at college.
Yeah, there's no interest from any of the sponsors, Senator Cassidy, Senator Casey, Senator Klobuchar. None of us is there an interest in dampening Greek life or saying that a sorority or fraternity can't be part of this campus. We have no interest in doing that. We do have interest in the sort of extremes that initiation might fall into or might reach that endanger students. I know it's not a challenge in fraternities. I mean, most fraternities and sororities don't have initiations that result in kids' deaths. I mean, that's unusual, but we've got to make it much, much more unusual. So HHS will, consulting with sororities and fraternities and universities and advocates and parents, will write these rules, and then the campuses will work to enforce them and make sure they're done in a way to stop these hazing deaths. But Greek life goes on, initiations go on the way that they can be done safely as they are in 99 out of 100 times.
I know I got to let you go in a second, but I wonder, Senator, if there are particular kinds of hazing that you're the most concerned about. I mean, just last week, there were parents of an alleged hazing victim who sued the Phi Gamma Delta fraternity at the University of Missouri for a victim who has apparently been on a ventilator for months now after suffering alcohol poisoning. So alcohol is one kind of hazing. Are there certain types of this behavior that, I know you're concerned about all of them, but are there certain types of it that you're most concerned about?
Well, most of it's got to do with alcohol. I mean, the deaths that I hear about and the parents I've talked to are almost always alcohol related. Then other things happen, but it's often a child dies from excessive alcohol. I mean, dies of alcohol poisoning, and it's not 2 or 3 drinks. It's the child drinking and the pressure from whoever's doing the initiation, not always a fraternity or sorority, but whoever's doing the initiation, the sort of unrelenting pressure on these kids to be one of the gang. And if you're 18 years old, I have to think back more years than you do, Joshua, to be 18. But you think of your insecurities, and you're going to respond to upperclassmen telling you what to do, and we've got to make sure these upperclassmen aren't telling them just to consume almost unlimited, excessive amounts of alcohol, because that has resulted in deaths too many times. So I think the more specific answer to your question, it's mostly about alcohol, but they will write the rules in a way that will cover other things too.
Ohio Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown, I appreciate your time, and it's good to see you again, sir. Thank you very much.
Thanks for you too, sir. Thanks.
Coming up, the Oscar nominations came out today. Some surprised critics, others broke barriers. We'll get to some of today's other big stories just ahead. Stay close. Let's update you now on some of the stories we've been following on our show. Let's begin on Capitol Hill with an unusual comment from one of the nation's Republican leaders about January 6th. Today, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell broke from the party when he described the attack on the Capitol as it was.
It was a violent insurrection for the purpose of trying to prevent the peaceful transfer of power after a legitimately certified election from one administration to the next. That's what it was.
The Republican National Committee recently passed a resolution calling the events of January 6th, quote, legitimate political discourse. Senator McConnell also disagreed with the RNC's move last week to censure Representatives Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. They are the only GOP members on the House committee investigating the attack. The Biden administration says it wants parents to get their taxes done, and that includes those who usually don't file because of income requirements. The administration says millions of families are still eligible for payments from the expanded child tax credit. Today, Vice President Kamala Harris helped kick off an outreach campaign. Similar events will take place in every state and in Puerto Rico during the tax filing season, encouraging parents to claim that credit. Last July, the federal government began to send these monthly payments, and that means there are 6 months of payments waiting to be claimed. Officials estimate refunds from this provision will add up to around $3,300 per household. Streaming services may be taking over the world. Granted, I work for one, but we got new proof of their power today with the Oscar nominations.
Sort of a lonesome place out here, Pete, unless you get in the swing of things.
That's Netflix's film The Power of the Dog. That got the most nominations, 12 in all, including Best Picture. Of the 10 nominees for Best Picture, half came from streaming services. Did you watch any of these? They include Netflix's Don't Look Up, Apple TV Plus's Coda, and 2 from Warner Brothers that ran on HBO Max, Dune and King Richard. Will Smith's portrayal in King Richard of Richard Williams, the father of Venus and Serena Williams, got him nominated for Best Actor. He has yet to win an Oscar. Other Best Actor nominees include Javier Bardem for Being the Ricardos, Denzel Washington for The Tragedy of Macbeth, Benedict Cumberbatch for The Power of the Dog, and Andrew Garfield for Tick, Tick, Boom. For Best Actress, the nominees are Jessica Chastain for The Eyes of Tammy Faye, Olivia Colman for The Lost Daughter, Nicole Kidman for Being the Ricardos, Penelope Cruz for Parallel Mothers, and Kristen Stewart for Spencer. This year also included a number of first-time nominees. Beyoncé, what do you get, the woman who has everything? An Academy Award nomination, this time for Best Original Song for Be Alive from King Richard. The only thing Beyoncé ain't got is an Oscar. Kristen Stewart is also a first-time nominee. And other first-timers include Kirsten Dunst for The Power of the Dog, Ariana DeBose for West Side Story, and supporting actor Troy Kotsur from Coda. He's also the first deaf person nominated for Best Actor. And where could be better to look at the stars than the Oscars? Maybe the International Space Station. But that stargazing station is going to plunge into the sea in a few years, on purpose. A former astronaut tells us where exactly it's set to crash and why when we come back. The countdown is on at NASA, not to a takeoff, but to a big splash down. The International Space Station will be retired after 23 years in service. The current station will remain busy for the better part of the next decade, until 2030. Then it will be taken out of orbit and sent plunging towards Earth, landing in the Pacific Ocean. NASA plans to create multiple new space stations through partnerships with 3 private companies: Blue Origin, NanoRacks LLC, and Northrop Grumman. They'll work alongside NASA to build and launch mixed-use stations. The new ones will house government space programs and private companies venturing into Earth's orbit. And those stations should be in orbit before the International Space Station is sunk. Joining us now is former NASA astronaut Mike Massimino. He's a professor of mechanical engineering at Columbia University. Professor Massimino, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Joshua, it's my pleasure to be here. Thanks.
So can we just talk about the long term for a second, the commercialization of space travel, the commercialization of space stations? What do you make of that? Is that on balance a good thing, a bad thing, mixed, too soon to tell? What do you think?
Well, I think we'll eventually find out, but I'm really hoping it's going to be a good thing, and I expect it to be a really good thing. It's something that NASA has been wanting to do for a long time, is turn over a lot of the operations in space and the benefits of space to private enterprise. And there were plans going way back decades ago at the beginning of the space shuttle program where they were looking to have commercially run space stations. And the thought was the space shuttle would be flying so often that it would go up there to retrieve experiments and bring people up there for a couple days and then bring them down. And that was all in the plan. And then they had the major accident in 1986, and that kind of ended that idea. So I think what's exciting now is that after all these decades, we're at the point where it looks like the idea of having commercial space stations can take hold once again.
Why get rid of the ISS? Why not just refurbish it, repair it, renovate it?
Well, it's going to be 30 years old, over 30 years old. Actually, a little more than that. It launched in 1998 and was tended with crews going up to visit and continue to build it until 2000, when we were able to permanently put people on board and change them out about every 6 months like we have been doing in these past 22 years. It's got about another 9 years according to the plan. You know, they might extend it a little bit, but 30 years is kind of a pretty long time for any spacecraft. That was the length of the shuttle program. And getting 30 years out of the space station, I think, is a pretty good goal. And we're not going to just give up on space stations. There's a plan. One of the plans is to add on to the current space station, and then when it deorbits it, have a commercial space station there in its place. Or, as you said, some of these other companies that might be launching a space station. So it's not like we're giving up on space stations. As hopefully we're going on to an improved way to conduct research in microgravity and have space stations that both the government and commercial enterprise can use. So, you know, 30 years is a pretty long time. If we can get that far with it, I'm sure we can. And we'll see. We'll see what the condition it's in at that time. But I think that's a pretty realistic goal, and then move on to the next phase.
Talk to me about what this decommissioning is going to be like. I think it's easy to hear about the ISS splashing down into the Pacific Ocean and think of something from like a Michael Bay movie. Like, I've seen this scene before, and it don't end well. How do you do that in a way that is controlled? You know what I'm saying? I'm being hyperbolic, but you get what I'm saying.
No,
like, the idea of a space station comes down through the sky just sounds like terror. Like, how does this work in a way that is controlled and manageable and that doesn't turn into like a Michael Bay movie?
Yeah, no, we don't want that. Michael Bay movies are pretty good, I guess, but we don't want that kind of disaster happening, if that's what you're referring to, of course. But no, what they'll do is they'll have a controlled re-entry, which means that there will be propulsion and guidance to guide it back through the Earth's atmosphere. A lot of it will probably burn up as it enters the atmosphere. Right now, the space station is traveling at 17,500 miles an hour. As they deorbit it, with having a controlled reentry, they'll do it in such a way that as it hits the atmosphere, it'll slow down, and through friction, as it slows down, it'll go thousands of degrees of heat. So a lot of it will disintegrate, will burn up in reentry, which is a good thing, actually. And then the larger pieces, which make it through that experience, will land in this area of the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean is really big. And you see Earth from space, it's blue for a reason, and that is that it's mostly water, and the biggest ocean is the Pacific Ocean. And the spot that they picked, just so no one gets nervous, is the most remote part of the Pacific Ocean. So it's the furthest away from any land. It's a remote area, and that's where the bigger pieces that survive reentry will land. So I think we can be pretty sure that it's going to be a safe reentry.
So it's going to re-enter in a controlled way. It's not going to fall, per se. It's kind of going to fly. It'll be guided down into the atmosphere, burn up largely, not become yet another massive piece of space junk orbiting the Earth. Before I have to let you go, I wonder if there is anything about the old space station that you might miss, or that you think that the space community might look back on fondly, even though it's not going to be in service anymore.
Oh, I think there's going to be lots of things. It's an incredible construction project, Joshua. When I first heard about this as a new astronaut, I became an astronaut, a NASA astronaut in 1996, and this was on its way to taking place, the space station, but we hadn't built anything yet. And the idea that you could take countries from around the world, countries of Europe, Japan, Canada, the United States, and Russia, cooperating to build this incredible engineering project in the sky, I didn't know if it could really happen. So I think international cooperation, what it's done in the past years after it was built, these past 10 years or so, the science potential has been unbelievable what they've been able to discover. So the game's not over yet. 2031 is still a ways away. We've got about another 10 years or so, another decade, where they're going to be using this space station to answer a lot of questions, make discoveries, understand how we can better go to the moon and settle there, and Mars. They've been growing vegetables there now for the past couple of years. Just think of what's going to be happening in the future. They've been sequencing DNA, 3D printing tools. Amazing things have happened in the past 10 years. I think these next 10 are going to be the most significant science-wise on the space station.
Columbia professor and former astronaut Mike Massimino. Professor, I appreciate you making time. Thank you very much.
Joshua, thanks for having me.
I'm Joshua Johnson. We'll see you tomorrow. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.